Hello, everyone, and welcome once again to another episode of Community Relations Corner, where we discuss issues of concern to New York's Jewish community and our friends and partners all over the city and the metropolitan area. I'm your host, Michael Miller, the Executive Vice President and CEO of the JCRC of the Jewish Community Relations Council of New York. On each episode of the Community Relations Corner, we're joined by guests representing the political, religious, economic, and diverse community leadership in New York, many of whom I've had the true honor of getting to know during the course of my tenure at JCRC as the CEO. Together, we'll discuss current events impacting the New York Jewish community and its neighbors, as well as the state of our city, the state of our state, and the state of our nation. But first, a word from our sponsor. This episode is sponsored by the wonderful people at the Free Synagogue of Flushing, serving the Reformed Jewish community in Queens, New York for over a century. Visit freesynagogeflushing.org for information about their Shabbat and holiday services, weekly Sunday school, and the beautiful spaces available for public rental. Once again, visit freesynagogeflushing.org. And today, we have a very special guest on the corner, somebody who I consider to be a very dear friend. He is a member currently of the New York City Council representing the South Bronx. And just last week, he won the election to become New York City's newest member of Congress, making him the first openly gay Afro-Latino elected to Congress. Maybe we'll call you a kind of a quasi member of the Jewish community as well. Please welcome Ritchie Torres. Thank you so much, Ritchie.
It is an honor to be here with you, Michael. I certainly consider you a friend. And I am deeply indebted to JCRC for giving me the opportunity to visit Israel not once, but twice, which remains one of the most formative experiences in my life. And I want to thank the Free Synagogue of Flushing. In a post-COVID world, I look forward to visiting.
Thanks so much, Ritchie. And we'll get to the Israel piece a little bit later in our conversation. And I very much want this to be a conversation. You've represented the South Bronx in the City Council since 2014, and you've been a champion on such issues as public housing, protecting gig workers, LGBTQ advocacy, and many, many other issues. So why did you decide to run for Congress?
Just a little bit about my personal story. My greatest passion is affordable housing. I spent most of my life in the Bronx. I was raised by a single mother who had to raise 3 children on minimum wage, which in the 1990s was $4.25. And I grew up in public housing, living in conditions of mold and mildew, leaks and lead, without reliable heat and hot water in the winter. And in New York City, public housing has been so savagely defunded by the federal government that it has $40 billion worth of capital needs. So there are senior citizens who are freezing during the cold of winter because boilers keep breaking down. There are disabled residents who are stranded in their top floor apartments because elevators keep breaking down. There are children who have been poisoned by lead. And I ran for public office to be an advocate for people like me who grew up in public housing. And I came to realize that in the city council, there was a limit to what I could do. I could shine a spotlight on the humanitarian crisis in public housing, but if I want to have a real impact, I need to be in Washington, D.C., because I came to realize much of what we do at the state and local level is essentially the administration of federal programs and priorities. And if I want to have an impact in improving the lives of people, then I need to be in Washington, D.C., because that's where the rules are set, that's where the purse strings are held. And that's where the future of the country is largely determined. So I see Congress as a natural progression from the city council. As a city council member, I have an on-the-ground knowledge of how federal policies operate at the local level.
We're going to get into some of the policy issues in a few moments, but I want to get back to the campaign. I understand the motivation, but you ran against 10 other candidates in the primary,
Yes.
including the former city council speaker, the vice chair of the DNC, the 2 fellow city council members, several activists, including one from DSA and one from a BLM of Greater New York. So how did you win?
Yes, I ran in the most fiercely contested congressional primary in New York City. I was one of 11 candidates. And I ultimately won for a few reasons. One, I represent a new generation of leadership. This was a change moment that unfolded against the backdrop of mass demonstrations and the COVID-19, and the voters of the South Bronx, much like voters elsewhere in the country, were yearning for a new generation of leadership. And second, I said to the voters, I'm one of you and I'm going to fight for you. And the voters of the South Bronx saw their own struggles, their own lived experiences in my personal story. So, I won not by catering to the extremes, but by running as a pragmatic problem solver who was going to focus like a laser on the bread and butter issues of health and housing, schools and jobs. Right? I won on the strength of my personal story and my record and my grassroots operation in the South Bronx.
Do you think that your victory has some parallels with how Joe Biden won the presidency?
I do. Joe Biden comes off as profoundly human and empathetic and authentic. He focuses on bread and butter issues, and he has broad appeal to the majority of the American people. It's in Joe Biden's nature to build coalitions, to build consensus. And I see myself, much like Joe Biden sees himself, as a unifying figure in a time of deep division.
I think it's so much needed because we see such polarization from right to left, from conservative to progressive. So what do you hope is accomplished kind of overarchingly in large terms within the framework of the next 4 years in a Biden administration? What do you want to see accomplished in essence?
Look, I'm a proud Democrat. I'm a progressive Democrat. There's going to be a limit to our ability to advance a progressive agenda because the fate of the Senate remains unclear, right? Republicans could continue to be in control of the Senate, and the filibuster remains a challenge. The priorities of the Democratic conference in the House often languishes in the Senate. The Senate is a graveyard for Democratic policies. For me, the highest priority should be to stabilize our local and state governments and to stabilize our public transit system. There have been moments in the history of New York City when the city government was in a fiscal crisis. There have been moments when the MTA, the public transit system, was in a fiscal crisis. We've never had a moment in the history of our country when New York state government, New York city government, and the public transit system were all caught in a fiscal death spiral at the same time. Like, we are in uncharted territory, dangerously uncharted territory. And we desperately need an infusion of emergency funding from the federal government. So stabilizing our local and state governments, which are on the front lines of providing vital services, should be our highest priority. I'm in favor of expanding the earned income tax credit, the child tax credit, hazard pay, unemployment insurance, so that we put more money in the pockets of struggling families, because the road to recovery runs through our families. It runs through our essential workforce, whose spending is going to have the greatest impact in stimulating our economy.
So in order to accomplish that, what committees do you want to serve on in the House of Representatives? Even though you are, or you will be a freshman member, I know you well enough that you're no backbencher. So what committees do you think you can be most effective on in order to serve your community, your constituency in the South Bronx, and to serve all New Yorkers, let alone all Americans?
Yeah. So, as a freshman, I'm going to face limitations. The 3 most powerful committees appropriations, which handles the budget, ways and means, which handles the tax code, and energy and commerce, which has the broadest legislative authority, including over healthcare. Those three committees historically have been beyond the reach of a freshman. So the committee that I'm seeking is financial services, because I have a deeply rooted passion for housing, and financial services has jurisdiction over housing policy.
So you talk about one committee, you're going to be.
That's my first committee. And then, and then, I have an open mind on the second committee. So, I have a background in oversight and investigation. So the oversight committee, I have an interest in foreign policy, foreign affairs. So I have an open mind on the second committee.
Are you excited about the possibility, the potential for the role that you're going to be playing on Capitol Hill? I mean, maybe share with our viewers maybe some of the experiences you've had in your past going down to Washington. Have you ever testified in front of Congress? I mean, is this going to be a quantum leap for Ritchie Torres from New York City Council to Capitol Hill, or is this something that you've kind of been preparing for? You've seen it before, you've been there before?
Not at all. I have almost no experience of Washington, D.C. I never thought in my wildest dreams that as a poor kid from the Bronx, I would become a United States congressman. It's an emotionally overwhelming experience for me, including my mother, who's my greatest cheerleader. And, when I went to DC a few weeks ago and met with the speaker, it finally sunk in. I'm going to be a United States congressman. I'm meeting with one of the most powerful people in the world.
Correct.
And I'm going to have the ability to legislate on a national stage. And it just never saw it coming. I do not fit into the typical profile of a member of Congress. I do not have fancy credentials. I do not come from a political family. I do not come from privilege. What I bring to the table is the wisdom of lived experience. I know what it's like to live in molded and leaking conditions in public housing, and to struggle with mental illness and substance abuse, and to have family that has come into contact with the criminal justice system. And I'm going to bring those lived experiences to inform my policymaking in Washington, D.C. So I will confess I'm a most unusual member of Congress, but I'm looking forward to adding value.
I'm sure that you will, knowing you as well as I do, and I think your constituents know you as well as you do as well as I do. That you bring tremendous value. I think one of the issues which I think emerged out of the presidential election was the concern that Americans have for their own health care. The COVID pandemic ranked, generally speaking, number one for those who voted for Joe Biden to become the next president of the United States. I know that our friends over at AARP want to know whether you're going to be supportive of particular proposals to make Social Security and Medicare solvent over the long term. And people also want to know and want to be assured that their health care is going to be addressed. So is that a priority of yours as well, stepping into your new role?
Without question. In the South Bronx, 1/4 of the Bronx economy is healthcare. The largest employer in the Bronx is the Montefiore Health System. So for me, it should be a priority of the Democratic Party to ensure that every American has access to quality, affordable healthcare. Right? The form that takes can be negotiable, but the right to healthcare should be non-negotiable. We should empower the federal government to negotiate drug prices with pharmaceutical companies, because the cost of prescription drugs has become prohibitively expensive. There are 25 million, there are 100 million Americans who either are diabetic or pre-diabetic, who either have a need for insulin in the present or will have a need for insulin in the future. And the cost of insulin has tripled in the span of 2 decades. So we have to drive down the cost of prescription drugs. We have to ensure that healthcare remains affordable, whether it's in the form of a public option or otherwise. For me, that should be front and center for the Democratic Party.
Right.
And we have to protect the integrity of Social Security and Medicare.
Okay. And in regard to COVID, disproportionately, minority populations, people of color, have not received the care that others have received. So I assume that that is also going to be very high on your agenda, and most especially for all New Yorkers, regardless of their economic status, the ability to access vaccinations once vaccinations are going to be distributed.
Yes, and we should ensure that the communities hit hardest are the priority for vaccinations, and everyone should have access to healthcare and access to vaccination, regardless of income and immigration status. Epidemiologists speak of bending the curve, but the truth is there is no single curve, there are multiple curves. And places like the South Bronx, communities of color, tend to be on the deadliest curve. During the peak of the pandemic, African Americans and Latinos, as well as residents of the South Bronx, had twice the likelihood of becoming seriously ill or dying from COVID-19. And so that's a reminder that we have to create a healthcare system that serves all of us.
Yeah, indeed. And in fact, at JCRC in New York, we've established, in the process of establishing a healthcare disparities coalition, interfaith coalition, across the board coalition to ensure that healthcare is dispensed equitably throughout our population, throughout our very, very diverse New York population. I want to kind of jump forward to what you talked about earlier, and that's the Israel issue. As we've talked now about universal matters, general matters, but let's talk about an issue of concern to probably a majority of our viewers, not all, who are Jewish, and even those who are not Jewish, who are concerned about Israel. So as you mentioned, we had the privilege and pleasure of having you travel twice with JCRC to Israel on missions. So what experiences there made you label yourself as a quote unquote progressive and pro-Israel political figure? What is it about that country that has attracted you, has just gotten into you to provide the support that you have been providing, the vocal support, and now as a member of Congress, a legislative support for a strong U.S.-Israel bilateral relationship?
For me, the state of Israel is a testament to the resilience and the ingenuity of the human spirit. The state of Israel has been in existence for only 70 years, which is young for a country. And yet it's emerged as one of the most liberal, democratic, innovative societies the world has ever seen, right? It is there's no country in the Middle East more protective of LGBTQ rights and women's rights, more protective of liberal democratic values than the state of Israel. When you go there as an American, the resemblance between Israel and the United States is striking. It's a society that's feels both ancient and modern at the same time, and it's remarkably innovative. The collaboration between Israel and New York City generates billions of dollars in economic growth. Israel produces more Nobel laureates proportionally than any other country on earth. Israel spends as a share of its GDP more in innovation than any other country on earth. It has more innovation per capita. So when you see a country that is as democratic and as innovative as Israel, how can you not help but celebrate what has been accomplished in a remarkably short span of time?
Yeah, I think we feel very much the same way. But
I mean, take the water. I love the water example. There's a book about Israel as a water superpower. It's one of the driest places on earth.
Right.
Yet it has emerged as what is referred to as a water superpower in the world. It's a leader in desalination technology.
Right, as well as technology as a whole, high tech and
Yeah.
startup nation status. So, what was it on either one of the trips or both? The one experience which, or two experiences which stand out for you that you can share with our viewing audience?
Well, when I went to Jerusalem, I we met with representatives from the Jerusalem Open House,
Right.
which was a safe space for the LGBTQ community. And to me, it was remarkable that the holiest city in the world, a city with the most devout Christians, Muslims, and Jews, had a safe space for the LGBTQ community. The Bronx at the time did not even have an LGBTQ center, but Jerusalem did, and I thought that left a lasting impression on me. And then the visit to Sderot,
Mm,
when I met with families who live in fear of rocket fire. Here in the United States, there are communities like mine that worry about gun violence,
correct.
but there are no communities that worry about rockets crashing down on their families and the trauma that comes from the siren sounds, from the terror and the fear of rocket fire. So that gave me a real appreciation for the unique security situation that Israel faces. And we have no concept of what Israel experiences unless we go there ourselves. Because as Americans, we have the luxury of being guarded by oceans, and we have neighbors like Canada and Mexico, and we have no concept of what it's like to be surrounded by hostile neighbors, by terrorist organizations like Hezbollah, which have more missiles than all of NATO combined, except the United States. The reality that Israel faces is radically different from our own here in the United States.
And now you're going to be going to Capitol Hill, going to the United States House of Representatives to be able to vote on legislation
Yeah.
authorizing funding for such units as technology as Iron Dome, which is now not only protecting Israel, but the United States of America is now investing in Iron Dome for our own safety, for our own troop safety as well.
The Iron Dome has been one of the great achievements of the American-Israeli relationship. So for me, to be pro-Israel has three principles.
Please.
It means defending Israel's right to exist and defend itself, which is the prerogatives of every state on the face of the earth. It means defending the Israeli-American relationship, which to me is not only a strategic alliance, but it's a friendship rooted in common values. And it means defending against anti-Semitism, no matter where it comes from, whether it's from the right or from the left. And I will speak out against anti-Semitism, whatever form it takes, even if it's in my own backyard.
And you always have, and we're always here in New York, been very, very grateful for your outspokenness in denouncing anti-Semitism in any of its forms, as well as all expressions of bigotry. But going back to the point that your first point about Israel's legitimacy, there are those who question Israel's legitimacy, challenge Israel's legitimacy, particularly those who support the boycott, divestment, and sanctions, the BDS movement, including the Democratic Socialists of America, the DSA, who in their questionnaire for prospective New York City Council candidates included a question about whether they should accept a trip to Israel, such as the trips that JCRC, we're the only ones who do it. So it was really targeting JCRC's missions to Israel for elected officials, including city council members. And the question also was, do you support the BDS movement? And if not, why? What would you say to a prospective city council candidate if they were to bring that questionnaire to you as to what response they should give and why?
I would tell them to travel to Israel because there's a value in seeing the situation for yourself and listening to a variety of perspectives. When I went to Israel, I spoke to both Israelis and Palestinians. And then among Israelis, I spoke to Arab Israelis, Jewish Israelis, Ethiopian Israelis. It is a far more racially and ethnically varied country than one would think. despite the popular media narrative, and speak to everyone and then come to your own conclusions. There's nothing remotely propagandistic about going to a country, asking hard questions, listening to a variety of voices, and then coming to your own conclusions. That's called learning. That's called education. No one's telling you that you have to go to Israel with a set of presuppositions. Go there with an open mind and listen, and then learn. So that's what I would tell people. And then I would tell them that, BDS is not a benign movement. It is an insidious form of anti-Semitism. One need not be Jewish or Israeli to see the anti-Semitic double standard against Israel, right? Israel is the only country on the face of the earth that is targeted for both delegitimation and destruction, right? Ask yourself a simple question. Why is there no BDS movement against China, which is detaining more than 1 million Muslims, or against Myanmar, which is ethnically cleansed Muslims, or against North Korea, which is a totalitarian state, or Iran, which is a leading sponsor of terrorism in the world, right? If the exclusive delegitimation of Israel is not explained by anti-Semitism, then what explains it? And I've never heard a satisfactory answer to that question, because none exist. Now, there are those who would draw a distinction between anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism, but I once heard an observer make the following point, that attempting to distinguish anti-Zionism from anti-Semitism is every bit as disingenuous as attempting to distinguish racism from segregationism. It's a distinction that exists on paper, but collapses in the real world.
Well, that's probably as well put as I've ever heard the challenge to the BDS movement. So thank you very much. But you also opened up the door to the greatest existential threat to Israel, which is the threat from Iran. And Iran, should it achieve nuclear capacity, would be a threat not only to Israel, but a threat to the United States of America and to many other countries, a threat to the world. What role should the United States play in ensuring that Iran does not achieve nuclear weapons capabilities? You're going to be sitting in the House of Representatives and probably dealing with these issues. And I don't know whether you've given it thought yet, but if you can share your views on it now, we'd be very, very, very grateful.
Yeah, so I'm hardly an expert, but I would state that there should be two overarching objectives, non-negotiable objectives. One is permanent denuclearization of Iran. And the second is an end to Iran's role in spreading terrorism in the region, right? And I would encourage people to read the New Yorker profile of Qasem Soleimani, because it gives real insight into the extent of Iranian influence and imperialism, right? The proxy wars that Iran has waged has been the driving force in the collapse of the state system in the Middle East. Yemen and Lebanon and Syria and Iraq, a whole host of states have been destabilized at the hands of Iranian influence and terrorism. And so for me, insisting on permanent denuclearization and insisting on an end to the proxy warfare, to the terrorism, those are two non-negotiable strategic objectives for the United States.
And I hope that you raise your voice in DC, both on the floor of the House as well as within the administration in that regard, because decisions are going to be made as to what direction the United States is going to be taking with regard to Iran. And what you have just laid out really does need resonance within the halls of Capitol Hill and the White House. So, thank you for articulating it as clearly as you did. And I want to turn now to the local front again and turn back to the fact that we're going to have an election next year, and there's going to be a citywide election as well as a city council election. And I'm more interested in what your views are on what you would see as the qualities you would want to have in the next mayor of the city of New York. Bill de Blasio is reaching his limits of his term. So there are multiple people who have put their names forward as wanting to be the next mayor of the city of New York without necessarily dealing with individual names, as opposed to the values that they identify with. What do you think a mayor of the city of New York needs within their character to be the next mayor of the city of New York and to handle all the issues that office requires the elected person to do?
The next mayor is likely to face one of the greatest challenges ever to confront our city. And we're governing in an age of fiscal crisis and political volatility. For me, the two most important values for the next mayor, the first is competence. We need a mayor who's going to govern the city effectively, who's going to ensure that the trash is picked up on time. It's not enough to have the right ideology, the right values and beliefs. You need to be able to operationalize those beliefs effectively in the real world. And then COVID-19 demonstrated to all of us the importance of competent government. We saw a catastrophic failure of pandemic preparedness that led to the loss of untold lives here in New York City and elsewhere in the country. So government competence is the most important value. Second is independence. We cannot afford to have elected officials who live in fear of the Twitter mob. We have to recognize there's a difference between Twitter and the real world. And we have to govern independently of the Twitter mob and govern independently of Twitter hashtags and do what is right and responsible for the city.
And what about the relationship between City Hall and Albany? What would you want to see in the next mayor to ensure that whatever he or she is going to be saying or doing is in concert with what's happening up in Albany, both in the executive side and the legislative side?
Look, in politics, you're only as effective as your relationships. Your relationships are the currency of politics. And the next mayor has to see to it that he or she has a productive working relationship with the city council, particularly the speaker, the state legislature, particularly the majority leader and the speaker, and the governor. You're only as effective as those relationships. Right? There are very few things that you can do unilateral, right? Politics is often a team sport, and you need to set a high premium on relationships.
Yeah, you're correct. And just to expand on that and jumping again out of New York and going nationally, but even including New York, of course, is within the framework of relationships, is that we have seen such deep polarities internal to American society. I mentioned it before, from right to left, from liberal to conservative, progressive to conservative. What role do you think that you can play to try to bridge those gaps and to heal the wounds, which I think are very deep and very raw, particularly after this presidential election?
Look, I have no illusions about the depth of divisions in our country, which are mirrored in Congress. But I believe it can and should be possible to build consensus and coalitions without compromising core convictions. There are issues on which we could conceivably build a consensus not only within the party, but across the parties. So I'll take one issue. One issue I care deeply about is vocational schooling. Mm-hmm. I feel like we have to rethink the notion that everyone has to go to a four-year college. It's been referred to as the cult of the baccalaureate, that everyone must go to a four-year college, learn Shakespeare, and then enter the workforce. There are some people who prefer and who are better suited to career and technical education and workforce development and union apprenticeships. And instead of steering everyone in a single direction, why not allow each person the flexibility and the freedom to choose the path that's right for him or her? So programs like Pell Grants should be every bit of it available to career and technical education as it is to college education. That is a vision for which I could build a bipartisan constituency, a bipartisan coalition. So I'm confident that on some issues, I'm going to be able to build coalitions in the survey, because ultimately what I care about are the results. I'm going to build whatever coalitions I need to build in order to deliver for the people of the South Bronx. I'm a pragmatic problem solver, first and foremost.
And you do plan on reaching out across the aisle to your Republican colleagues?
Of course, if you and I agree 1% of the time, we should work together on 1% of the issues. And when we disagree, I'm going to stand firmly by my beliefs and you'll stand firmly by yours, but we'll agree to disagree. It's a pluralistic country.
That's very refreshing to hear. We're kind of.
I refuse. Look, and I refuse to we're all in this together. We have no choice but to coexist, right? Politics is about conflict resolution. Politics is meant to be an alternative to warfare. And I refuse to take a moralistic approach and assume that those who disagree with me are not merely wrong, but evil. Right. You have to develop a working relationship and achieve compromise wherever possible.
Thank you. And we appreciate so much that spirit of coalition building, something which we at JCRC emulate on the community basis of building coalitions across faiths, across ethnicities and language groups. Why not across political parties? So we're kind of winding down, and I want to just pose quick questions to you. One of them is, I hope that when we have what's probably going to be a virtual congressional breakfast in February, we hope to be able to have you participate in it and give an update on your first month in Washington, D.C. And secondly, is there any particular message that you'd like to send to the Jewish community, supporters of Israel, and supporters of combating anti-Semitism? Just a quick message.
The answer is yes. It goes without saying.
Thank you.
And I would say that, I would be careful to tell, and particularly progressives who are pro-Israel, just never allow yourself to be censored. Never allow yourself to be in the closet, so to speak. We all have to be visible and vocal and fearless and forceful in denouncing anti-Semitism. We are on the side of truth, and we should be unapologetically in defending it. So be bold, be brave. That's my advice.
Yeah, I give that advice too. Thank you. It's wonderful to hear your voice. You have been bold, you have been brave, and you have been outspoken. And we thank you so much for joining us on Community Relations Corner. It's really an honor to have you here with us. But I'm going to read the advertisement for our sponsor once more, and then turn it back to you for one last word. So think about what you want to say. While I thank the Free Synagogue of Flushing, who are sponsoring this episode, serving the Reformed Jewish community in Queens, New York for over a century. Visit freesynagogueflushing.org to learn about a wide array of programming, and the beautiful sanctuary, social hall, and meditation garden are available for rent for your special occasions. Visit freesynagogueflushing.org to learn about their Shabbat and holiday services and weekly Sunday school. Once again, it's freesynagogueflushing.org. And my regular shout out to our board member there, President Ed Schauder, to their cantor and executive director, Alan Brava, and to Rabbi Jeffrey Gale. All of them are wonderful friends, and certainly we thank them so much for sponsoring the Community Relations Corner. And I also, before I turn it over to you, want to thank what I'm now going to be referring to as the 3 Gs, is Gilboard, Grossman, and Glick. Noam Gilboard, Rebecca Grossman, and Jennifer Glick, who are my production team, who make sure that we have a Community Relations Corner and have the wonderful guests such as Congressman-elect Ritchie Torres on with us. Now, Ritchie, back to you for a last word.
I just want to thank you, Michael. I feel like you're one of the greatest public servants of our city, and
Thank you.
I'm looking forward to partnering with you in repairing the world and building a more perfect union. So thank you for your friendship and for your public service.
Well, thank you. The feelings are very, very mutual, and I certainly look forward. JCRC looks forward to working together with you for many, many years to come to ensure not only the repair of the world, but the bridging of our communities as well, which is all a part of that. It's really just a privilege to know you and to know that you're stepping up professionally into a role where you can influence life not only here in New York, but across the country. So thank you so much for being our guest, and our thanks to our audience for joining us live. And before I say farewell, I haven't done this before, but we're going to do it now. Join us next week for the first ever joint appearance and interview with Israel Nitzan, the acting consul general of the State of Israel, and Abdallah Shahin, the Consul General of the United Arab Emirates.
Oh, wow.
First joint appearance of the two consuls general on Community Relations Corner from Israel and from the UAE. It'll be next Thursday, November 19th at 12 noon. Please put it on your calendars. Of course, we're going to be circulating the announcement. And if you can't listen to it, my dear friend Ritchie, hopefully your staff can, but it's going to be on Facebook and a variety of other places for forever. But we're very, very excited, as excited as I have been to have you on. I'm excited to have the Consul General of Israel and the Consul General of the UAE on next week. Thank you all very much. We look forward to seeing you next time on Community Relations Corner. Shalom to all. Thank you. Bye.